Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our book talk. Tonight's book talk features Dr. Holly Pinheiro talking about the family civil war, Black soldiers and the fight for racial justice, excuse me. Dr. Pinheiro is going to be presenting his book in conversation with, with Dr. Hilary Green. In a moment, I wanted to thank you all for tuning in tonight. This program is being presented as part of our program in African American history, one of the most vital and exciting programs that we have at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I'd also be remiss for any of you who are not already members or shareholders in the Library Company. And if you are enjoying this program tonight, I would love for you to sign up and join our learning community. The Library Company is a wonderful learning community for people who are interested in the intersection of history and American life. It is a place where, as you will tonight, find out sort of the latest and latest historical interpretations, get sort of the freshest history, the newest history, if you will, that helps us to understand where we came from and the culture in which we live. Dr. Holly Pinheiro is an assistant professor of African American history at Furman University. He is the author of articles in American 19th Century History, the African American Intellectual History Society's Black Perspectives blog, and the Journal of the Civil War Era's Muster blog. His research focuses on the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the military from 1850 through the 1930s. He was a short-term fellow at the Library Company in our program in African American history in 2015, from 2015 to 2016. Dr. Pinheiro's interlocutor, if I may use that word, he'll be talking tonight with Dr. Hilary Green, who is a professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Dr. Green has a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, a master's in history from Tufts University, and a bachelor's degree in history with minors in Africana Studies and pre-healing arts from Franklin and Marshall College. Her work explores the intersections of race, class, and gender in pre-1920 African American history, Reconstruction studies, and Civil War memory. Dr. Green's first book, Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890, explored how African Americans and their white allies created, developed, and sustained a system of African American education schools during the transition from slavery to freedom in Richmond, Virginia, and Mobile, Alabama. Her in-progress second book focuses on how African Americans remembered and commemorated the American Civil War and its legacy. In January 2015, Dr. Green also created the Hallowed Grounds Project for exploring the history of race, slavery, and memory at the University of Alabama and the post-emancipation developments in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. A word before we get started tonight, and then I'll hand it off to Dr. Pinheiro and Dr. Green. This is being presented at the format we're using tonight. If you have questions, we will be answering your questions, or we will have a question and answer period at the end of the talk, probably around 7:45 or so. If you have a question, put it into the Q&A area that you find at the bottom of your screen. Probably don't use the chat, but use the Q&A for it. We'll be looking at both of them, but using the Q&A will make it easier for us to find your question and to ask it. So without any further ado, let me ask Dr. Green and Dr. Pinheiro to take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for the audience for being in attendance and allowing Holly and I to talk about his fine book. If you haven't purchased it, please do. It's right here. It's a really great book. And a lot of the questions is to help get you to think about what it means to talk about the Civil War and the Black military experience and Philadelphia in particular. but by those who we don't always look at, the working poor, their families, and their long struggle just before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. So I know, Holly, that you in this book focus on 185 veterans and their families, um, largely focus on the third, the sixth, and the eighth USCT that come from Philadelphia, and you really look at the Philadelphia story. So my first question is, what got you interested in this topic, and why Philly?
That's a great question. So firstly, sorry, I'm just writing these down so I can remember. I just want to thank Library Company of Philadelphia. Like, I can still remember going through the archives, taking photos, being excited, seeing the recruitment posters, just, it was very pivotal for my research. Not only for this book, I want to be clear, for finishing my dissertation and really every article that I published since and will continue to do. So I am eternally grateful to everyone at the Library Company and for Dr. Green's mentorship through this whole process. If I were to try to point it down to, I guess, a few things, I'd say first and foremost is my family's commitment. I can remember, I think I was about 10 years old, my uncles had me reading Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X's autobiographies. And I always have to be clear, I didn't truly grasp the depth of what was being said, but it was, they were very intentional about, you need to know your history and you need to hear it from the people, not how it's being told, through books and whatnot. Like, hear it from these people's mouths and how they understand. And as much as I love yet hate saying it, like Glory, that film that came out in what, 1990?
89.
89. All right, my bad. 89. If you haven't seen it, it's a phenomenal movie, Academy Award winning. It's got Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman, you name it. Basically a who's who in the 80s and 90s of acting. That's a film that I had watched every year in social studies, and I hate to say it out loud, but I've seen it so many times I can quote the entire movie word for word, which makes me really sad sometimes but it's like I loved that so much, and it undoubtedly influenced me. Why Philly? When I started this as my dissertation, truthfully, partly I wanted to see if I had any family connection. I have family that are in Philly and in New York. So my dissertation looked at Black Philadelphians and Black New Yorkers in New York City to kind of see what was life like for these Black communities from 1850 into the 1880s. And then also, truthfully, I have relatives that still live there. So doing the research is a lot easier when you have relatives you can crash on their couch. But throughout doing the research, it was evident to me that we all know Philadelphia's rich history. We know it, not just Black history, to be clear, women's history and educational, you name it. And for me, it's rife with so much source material. And there's been a number of scholars who have and will continue to study it, including W.E.B. Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro, which is a great study that I think gets overlooked a lot by modern scholars and people to understand Black Philadelphia and Black Northern experiences. But I would say that I really just wanted to understand what life is like for African Americans who were not enslaved. And that's not to dismiss those who were enslaved. I always want to be clear on this. Having relatives who were enslaved in the Carolinas and Florida, their histories should always be told. But understanding what life was like for free Black people long before Lincoln emancipated, slavery was banned in Pennsylvania, as many of y'all know, I'm sure. And what are their circumstances? What was their educational experiences? What was their work like? What was their home life like? And these were things that I was really, I don't want to say obsessed with, I was really curious about because, and I'm just speaking out loud, these are things I was never taught in history courses. It was to understand Black people in the Civil War era, we talk about slavery and that's it. And that's omitting hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really like, that you go beyond the known people like Frederick Douglass, and then others, Purvis and those who recruited, to the working people who actually enlisted. And
Yes.
And I know we talk about this. So Philadelphia, my own family's history, they trained at Camp William Penn, but they're coming from rural central Pennsylvania and they take the trains in. What you do by focusing on those from Philadelphia and the working poor is really, as I'm going to use a quote from your book here, you want to do a holistic analysis of these people's lives. And you want to study who these people were, their whole family histories, what were their circumstances, and really trace them through from before the war until after the war, including their fights for pensions.
Yeah.
And I think that holistic view, and by doing that, you get to bring in someone who's oftentimes ignored, their families. So why did you focus on not just the soldiers as people like Kelly Mesrick and Dubois, but also to classic studies like Benjamin Quarles books that focus on just the soldiering, but
Right.
you make sure their families are included.
Right.
What does it mean to include those families in this holistic analysis that you're trying to do?
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to give a shout out to James G. Mendez, whose book, A Great Sacrifice, is also one that looks at Black Philadelphia. I mean, truthfully, Hillary, it's because I am the child of a service member. My mother served for 25 years in the United States Navy, and I've always struggled with what her service meant to me as her son. And this was as a kid. I was very frustrated when she would get deployed. For the audience, for context, moving to Greenville, South Carolina is the 30th place I've lived in the world. Right. Like, so I've moved a lot and I love my mom dearly. But as a kid, I was very upset. She was a single woman raising multiple children and getting deployed into combat zones. And as a kid, I don't understand that. What I understand is mom is gone. Or when she retired after her years of service, mom is unemployed. Mom is struggling with like battling in the 1990s for a pension. So I sat with that a lot about, if I'm experiencing this now, what was it like then at this defining moments really in American history? And I'll just say that for me, I think that bringing in that personal experience as your next book, and I say this to the audience, you will want to read Dr. Green's next book. I say this with all sincerity, it is going to change the way we understand history in so many ways. It's really important to humanize these people's lives. And it doesn't matter if we're just talking of like, not just the Civil War era, not just African Americans, anyone who served never does it alone. Whether when they enlist, whether we're talking issues of pay not coming, if we're talking about getting notifications of a deceased relative, if we're trying to find evidence to satisfy the federal government on the legitimacy of their dynamics, they were at war too. And many times these families didn't, and no one knew really that, like, by enlisting, even if the soldier never went through the whole process and they apply for a pension, they have opened up their private life across multiple generations into the scrutiny and oversight of the federal government. And so and I saw that in the pensions, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And so for me, I followed where the records were. And I will say, as a shout out to tomorrow's event, I believe at 12 o'clock, I'm going to talk about only a few, but there are many of the sources that the LCP has that has been very helpful and continues to be helpful in my work. And I thought it was very important to respect the families, to understand who were these soldiers as young children, who are their mothers, and that, Dr. Green was gracious enough to show the book cover. I'm very, very happy that it is a group of women on that cover, because it to me demonstrates that we need to stop only looking at men in uniform and understand that their families experience that trauma too. And Dr. Green, I use this all the time when talking about your stuff, is that these families are the living monuments. And we need to understand and respect how they saw and experienced war, even before putting on the uniform. Because for me, one thing that I saw was Black people in Philly were fighting for equality long before 1861. And I saw it in public education. I saw it in the Institute for Colored Youth. I saw it when they're trying to navigate walking to and from on the city streets. And so by including the family dynamic, I was able, I hope this was conveyed in the book, a way of like, we can understand women are part of military history. That is a fact. That Black women were critical during the war, after and before in fighting for equality. And even children were thrust into the battle lines in terms of education.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think is abundantly clear. And you have this line at how soldiering and being a soldier has the potential of making already dire circumstances even worse,
Right.
and the financial precarity of these families. So one of the things I want to transition somewhat is, because you focus a lot about families, were there any families that you really stood out to you that conveyed what you were trying to show about the holistic view and how soldiering really could be transformative, but also
Right.
in both positive and negatively for those families left behind?
And I will just say that I was always trying to follow where the records went. And even though at times, for those who haven't read the book, if you do, it's easy to look at the hardships that these families are experiencing and see them only as victims. But I wanted to also understand and acknowledge their agency in the ways in which they're never giving up to be remembered. And that is across generations. And I thought that was very important. And I saw that come through, and this spoils the end of the book. Edmonia Woodson. I vividly remember being in the National Archives. And for those who haven't used or looked at a Civil War pension, they're amazing sources. They're very problematic. I want to be clear. But as Dr. Green knows, like, you never know what each record has. And so each time you're kind of processing it, you're just looking through. And what I found in Woodson's record was she had a communication with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, at the height of the Great Depression. And I'm going to paraphrase the discourse between them. Edmonia basically says to the First Lady in this handwritten letter, look, I know in the grand scheme of what's happening in the world that I don't matter, that I'm just a poor Black woman from Philly. My father has died. He enlisted and served in a Pennsylvania regiment. He has passed on. My mother has been rejected for a widow's pension and is dying of cancer. And I also have cancer. Will you look into my case? And the First Lady responds in a handwritten letter, basically saying yes. And then the fact to me that I always say this, and I say it as a joke, but I mean it seriously. The First Lady, the height of the Great Depression, responds to this woman that she's never met in 7 days. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And then the First Lady then demands that the Pension Bureau, which becomes the VA, you're going to look into this case, not tomorrow, not next week, right now, and you will get me an answer. And by that acknowledgement of that request, I believe that the First Lady is refuting the lost cause, because she is acknowledging the persistence and agency of this daughter to not be forgotten. I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the family of Alfred Rothwell and his entire family. Like, they were one of the first families that I studied for my dissertation, and to see the ways in which his service impacted their entire family, it was heartbreaking, because unfortunately he did die in service. He left behind a wife and multiple children, and she had to navigate life, including the pension application process, without her partner. And I will say that if you look to the back of the book, I have a list of all of the soldiers' names, the date of their enlistment, how old they were, their occupations, because I thought it was important for people to find themselves. And by happenstance, actually, Alfred Rothwell's descendant has reached out to me, and I've had the privilege of being able to hear from her how important this book is. And I won't read her email because it'll make me cry like a baby, because I'm a crier. But it was just the fact that after she read the book, and I'm going to start crying, as she said, that you've done the women in my family justice, and that you see all of us, not just Alfred. And that's important. And I've had the privilege with Dr. Green's assistance of getting this descendant to write about what it means, because she's also doing her family's history and she's finding out new things. So it's exciting to see her excitement in that. It was just something I never envisioned. And then the other one that really stuck out to me was Benjamin Davis and Mary Leighton. And that was a family that is actually connected to the 54th Massachusetts. The very short version is he is unable to enlist in the 54th. He will successfully enlist in the 6th, I believe, but he will unfortunately die as a prisoner of war. And unfortunately, the trauma that his family experiences continues well into the late 19th century. And the fact, and I remember talking to a friend of mine when I read Mary Leighton's pension, because she says, in I think 1884, essentially the United States Army and government has won the Civil War. Congratulations. You've destroyed my family in the process. And I vividly remember calling a friend like, what do I do? This goes against everything I thought my main arguments were. And they were said, you need to acknowledge her family's experiences. So she's actually how I open the book, is with her statement, because it is important that we don't just take the pie in the sky, and we understand that these families have great moments, hard moments, but they were fighting.
Yeah, and I think that becomes clear because one of the things that you do well is the pensions. And you were fortunate in going through and having the pensions available at the National Archives, and were able to mine through. And I know for my own pension fight, just to get my own Civil War ancestors pension, Joseph Lane of the 22nd USCT, it took me 5 years to get a pension because it was at Veterans Affairs. But the way you read pensions, the way you scour these as biographies of families, can you talk a little bit about the pension?
Yeah.
What does when one applies for a pension, how does the state get involved? And what's the most common outcome for those who are successful? But what happens if you're rejected?
I'll just start out by saying, I've never actually sat and thought about pensions as biographies. So thank you for that. I'm going to do something with that. For the audience, the Civil War pensions actually they go back all the way, arguably, to the Revolutionary War. I mean, post-Revolutionary War, there were federal pensions for military service. So that's how long of a history they have. By the Civil War, for all of the complexities of the pension process, they never stipulated race. So it actually, because of that, opened up opportunities for non-white men and families to apply for a pension, Civil War pension. There were what they called invalid or a veteran's pension. There was widow's pension, minor's pension up to the age of 16, and then fathers and mothers. And I've only had one case of a father's. I think that's one that needs more examination. As Dr. Brandy Brimmer in her book, Claiming Union Widowhood, has shown, even understanding Black women's experiences with the pensions, it's highly bureaucratic, it's highly complicated. And I hoped, and I know Dr. Green's book does this, is we talk a lot about the hardships that freed families had navigating the pension process. Unfortunately, because of things like not being literate, not having the documentation, which was sometimes destroyed due to the war, or even just an angry former enslaver who decided they were just going to do what they wanted. So there were ways in which freed people were able to navigate the process without getting extensive documentation. For freeborn African Americans, it was in some ways harder because there was, unfortunately, from local, state, and even communal society, this expectation that one was supposed to get a legal marriage. And that's one of the ways where the book's title for me comes through, is the war, particularly from the federal government, over the legitimacy. And so, for example, African Americans saw their families as legitimate. And that comes through in the pensions. Someone would say, Holly and Joan were Mr. and Mrs., and that's how we saw them. But to the Pension Bureau, particularly pension agents, didn't matter. If you didn't have a legal documentation or proof, then it's illegitimate and your family is rejected from this. And as Dr. Green's recent piece has shown, that rejection, I can't even begin to compute what it means on a personal level. I know what it means as a historian. And for me, the frustration, particularly if we're talking about an invalid or a veteran, was the ones in which veterans with various disabilities were getting rejected, even when sometimes their commanding officers who were there were like, I saw it, this is real. But the Pension Bureau would come in and say, I don't care. Because for context, by the late 19th century, Civil War pensions made up the majority of the federal budget. And many presidential campaigns, that was a key argument. So it was incentivized by the Pension Bureau to cull the rolls. And some of the experiences, particularly for Black women and the offspring, it was horrific to see the ways in which the federal government was so invasive into the private lives. Seeing things like, unfortunately, one of the widows of a veteran who had passed away, she had a child previously before she married this veteran. And in order to get a pension, she had to tell a committee of pension agents, all white men, about the first time she was intimate with another man in order to satisfy, like, they wanted to know what was the circumstances of this child being born. And I remember crying, calling my mom and just like, how do I even unpack this? Like, I can't even put myself into this situation. And my mom said, how is she, what is her tone? Like, what are you reading in her tone? And what is she saying? And in the source, the woman basically says, it happened. I met this person at this date. This is what happened. And we had a child, and I will never talk about it again. And to me, it was like, even in that discriminatory moment, she took power over her oppressors. But it was difficult seeing the ways in which the federal government was forcing these African-American families to supply sometimes their only document of their marriage, including a marriage certificate, and then denying those widows the document back because they became federal records. And it's just like these kinds of battles about family structures, about the ways in which white surveillance on Black families was truly shocking and is something that I think deserves more attention. And I will say there is a great number of scholars, including, just some to name a few, Nora Lee Frankel, Megan McClintock, Donald Schaefer, and many others. And we could continue to investigate pensions, as Dr. Green said, to understand Black families and Black communities. Because one of the beauties that I loved about the pensions is the witnesses. Mm-hmm. Usually what happened is the witnesses, if I was providing testimony in your case, I might all of a sudden go, look, I know you want to hear about that, but let me tell you my story real fast. And then there's a 40-page biography that has really nothing to do with the case other than this. I believe African Americans understood this is maybe their one opportunity to have something documented because they don't have the time, the resources to sit down and catalog their life like the Purvisons and the Fortons and others did. So Dr. Green is right. We could and should look at these pensions as biographies, even though you have to understand the ways in which the pension agents interjected themselves into the assessment.
Yeah, and that's something that becomes clear because you also look at the widow's pensions, but what happens when a widow is rejected and then the pension office intercedes and appoints a white guardian? It has nothing to do with the kids, nothing to do with the family. But sometimes the children are more successful than their mothers. And I think it's one of the things in that you have the veteran, the widow, the mother sometimes, and then you also have the children. What does that say about resiliency and how they are using memory of their family service and claims of citizenship that's getting them to persist?
Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties, I think, of the pension is that, as Dr. Brimmer notes, I believe she calls it the grassroots pension network. Once African Americans, at least if one individual was successful, they would try to provide assistance, including who to talk to, who not to talk to, lawyers and all these kinds of things to help each other. And I think that was important in attempting to just try to figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy. I mean, we talk about now like signing things in triplicate. Imagine having the federal government looking into your private life over a 50-year period and asking you questions from 40 years ago. And if you don't remember it exactly the way you said it 40 years ago, that could jeopardize your case. Like, it's that kind of meticulousness into these people's lives. I would agree 100% that the children's and grandchildren's voices are there. And one of the cases that stuck out for me was, it was a daughter, her father had died. She buried him, and she wrote the Pension Bureau at what seemed like once a month for a number of years, and basically said, "Dear federal government, you owe me for my father's burial. The undertaker bill, the livery, the casket, all that. That's the least you can do. He gave his life to save this country." And at one point, the Bureau essentially responds to her and says, "Look, if you'll stop writing the letters, we'll give you the money." And I remember I was so proud of that, because I was like, wow, she got the federal government to bow to her resiliency. And that was important because she never forgot. And she made sure every month, what felt like, to make sure the federal government never forgot. And while she's not writing history books like Joseph Wilson and Isaac Hill and many Men of Mark and William J. Simmons, she's doing it stuff, and it worked. So we need to understand that Black women were extremely resilient. And also, just for the audience, you can find Black women's voices, especially working poor and working class Black women's voices, not just in Philly, in Pennsylvania, in the like you name it, in these records. They're there. And I will say in my second book, I'm going to be focusing on all Black Pennsylvanians and their experiences at Camp William Penn and the battle to get to train, to understand that we need to recognize not just Philly, and I love Philly, but we need to also understand Black Pennsylvania as well.
And as I'm so happy to hear that. So, because with my mother's family being from Franklin, Cumberland, and Fulton County since 1820 as free people of color and who have enlisted, we always say, like, what about us in the middle part of the state here?
Right.
They still live in those counties, but
Right.
they all had that Philadelphia experience. So
Right.
one of the things I want to do, transition from the pensions to what's the main takeaway that you want the audience to get from your book. And then I want to talk about your appendixes for families doing research.
I would say main takeaways is one, as I've said to the descendant that I've had the privilege to talk to, is that we as a society, and especially as historians, we need to put more respect on what families sacrifice. And as I told this descendant, your family, in my opinion, is directly responsible for many things I take for granted right now. Your family gave arguably everything to save this country at a defining moment. And it's important to empower and uplift people who, as this descendant had told me, who feel like they've been forgotten in historiography. We talk a lot about Douglass. We talk a lot about the Fortons and the Purvises and Octavius Cotto and Jacob C. White, David Bowser, and these are very important people. But what about turning our attention to those people in the audience that Douglass was speaking to at Mother Bethel? What about turning to the people that the Christian Recorder was beseeching to enlist? If William D. Kelly, during his recruitment campaign with Anna Dickinson and Frederick Douglass, says to the audience that Black women were the most important people to the war effort by 1863, and he's talking to the potential mothers who will help recruit, why don't we acknowledge that? I also want to make it hopefully clear in this book and all my work, we need to put more respect on women's history and gender history is very important to understanding military history. Douglass, for example, is talking all day long about Black manhood. So if they're using gender ideology then, why don't we? But we also have to understand Black womanhood. Many of the regimental flags, especially in Pennsylvania and New York State, those were created through the efforts of Black women. So, and Black women were at these camps, like they're sacrificing everything. And that has been my personal mission since starting this book is we need to illuminate and respect the ways in which Black people, in particular Black women, have given us what we have today. And my hope of all hopes is that, especially the methods in the back book, I put the methods so that way anyone could hopefully find themselves, right? Or maybe you're just interested in, I have a distant relative, or I just want to learn how to find these people's lives. Like, so you can see how I did the research, because I don't want it to be a mystery. I want people to feel like, thank you. So,
Yeah, and that's something that became very clear is one of the things I appreciate is not only the 185 men by regiment for families who don't know, who are not academics, who don't know where to start, by having a resource at the back of the book for them to find family and know based on then going through your notes and stuff, how they can track down that information. Because in the end, it's information that's being hidden from families in order to get pensions, in order to get served. And the 21st century descendants have no clue how to get that history because we're not taught. But the other thing I really liked is something that I heard recently in my pension fight and writing from the perspective of my own mother when looking at who was her grandmother was her grandmother's grandmother was in the household, the last Black Civil War veteran from Shippensburg, Pennsylvania in the 1930s. And the 5-year pension fight, like all eyes were on me to get this information. But one of the things as I was trying to go through and process and speak the bureaucratic speak to get the physical pension, I was reminded of one important fact from her. She's like, this is more than a name on a page. This is more than a name that was rejected by the pension office. This was grandma's grandma. This was my mother's grandmother. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting, and I think about 2 ways. How do we get other scholars who do not do Black history well and want to say they can't find Black people to think about whose descendants in the present, whose grandmother's grandmother are we talking about? And what do we have to do to get beyond the lack of will to do this work?
right.
And then the second part is, what do we say to descendants who, for those who do choose to take an ethics of care like you do in this book? What is our commitment to them to help tell the fuller stories going forward when our profession doesn't always do that?
I mean, I'll just say those are very powerful points and questions. What I'll just say, and this is my personal, and again, coming back to, I think it's partly because, well, there's no question, because I was in that military culture. Like I still have it, and my students are always like, you come across like you served. I'm like, well, sorta, I lived it for a long time, so I tangentially, I guess, not really. But it's just like, I really think it's important to recognize, and even not just these people, if we're just talking history, I always try to teach and talk about history of like, it's important that we remember people and not just the famous people. Like, I love Frederick Douglass, but I'm good on Douglass for a while. Like, I really am. I want to know, how was Douglass received by the Black community? I want to know, were there people, Black people, who would have gone, I don't know if this is for me right now. Because one thing for me, when Douglass says, you're not a man unless you put the eagle on the button, that's a very, to me, ableist view. Because what if I had a disability that did not allow me to enlist? Or what if the reality of life in Black Philadelphia at that time made it to where if I left, my family would disintegrate because everyone, including children, sometimes when it's 5 years old, had to work. So pulling anyone away from the home, and they don't get paid for 9 months, as I tell my students, if Furman don't pay me on the first of the month, one of y'all are teaching class, because I'm out, because I have responsibilities, and they did too. I take very seriously the people in this book, and that I study, because I want, at minimum, if they see their name and know in my writing that I'm saying thank you, I see you. I hope that is. I know it's not enough, but I hope it's a start. And what I would say about how do we get scholars? All right, I'm gonna get a little spicy because it's 7:42. Some scholars are just lazy. Keeping it as honest as I can. I think it's easy to study the famous people. It's easy to study the people that have a lot of documentation that they left behind. It was very hard to do this book. It was hard for me to do my dissertation, but at the same time, the reward of the finished product and to get the stamp of approval of the relative is more than I could ever dream. This book never wins a book prize. I don't care. What I want this book in Philadelphian schools, in the community colleges. I went to community college, so I'm always going to advocate for community colleges. I want this at book clubs. I hope maybe someone in this audience, because I'll just say for context, I did a presentation virtually last year, and one of the descendants was in the meeting, and that's how that started. So maybe one of you is actually a descendant. So I would encourage you to check the back of the book to see maybe you're in there. And if you are, I would love to hear from you, because I hope I've done your family justice. And I think it's important that academics, we don't just write for ourselves, that we're writing to empower and to respect the people who have given us what we have. And I say us as a society, right? We can't just focus on the famous. We need to talk about the people who did the work that the famous people talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I really deeply admire about the work is you made this as an inviting space, because our profession's not always invited. And it's usually seen, we're not seen as the Civil War historians.
Yeah,
We're
Dr. Green and
not.
I are unfortunately not seen as Civil War scholars.
Yeah.
When I wrote this book, I was told that's gender history, that's women's history, that's not Civil War history. So, I mean, and Dr. Green has heard similar and unfortunately worse. And I can see how an academic gets disenchanted, but it's opportunities like this, it's meeting communities. And to me, this is important, because I don't truthfully enjoy presenting at universities and colleges anymore. I prefer to talk to communities, because I want them to hear this.
And that's one of the things I want to conclude with is for those who know, I'm the editor for Muster. And this upcoming Tuesday, Dr. Pinheiro did an interview with one of the descendants of a family that is discussed in the book. So if you want to continue to see how the immediate impact of this is, especially for those who might be descendants in the room, check out his methodology section in the back of the book. I can't add any more, except if you want to go and find a pension that's at the Veterans Affairs, which requires a FOIA versus National Archives. But it's these types of resources that are so key for scholars, but also families. And that interview with Michelle Morrison is very important. So I just want to allow Holly in the last minute before we start having questions. Can you describe that exchange and the email to you that got this conversation started that we will see follow up on Tuesday?
All right, so I'll just say the short version. When I got the email, I thought it was a prank. Usually I thought it was one of my students, to be honest, like, haha, real funny. And then we Zoomed and we talked for an hour. And I can remember that part of it was like, she was asking like, well, what do you know, about family? And we started going back and forth, and I told her stuff I didn't even write into the book about, oh, they got married here and they went to school here and the kid. And she looked at me like, you do know my family's history. And I remember saying like, I studied your family since like 2012. Like I considered your family my family because they helped me finish grad school. And so like, and I could tell she knew I wasn't just saying that to make her like feel good. Like I mean that. And I always tell her when I talk to her, like, thank you. And she's an amazing person and doing some important work in Pennsylvania, not just with her family, but to continue to commemorate Black communities and their sacrifices. And just know that Dr. Green, as the editor of Muster, I would assume, I don't want to speak for her, would welcome other opportunities. So if someone in the audience is interested in that, it was a privilege and an honor. And I'm very grateful that Dr. Green gave both of us that opportunity, just like I'm grateful for myself.
Yes, and for me, I am grateful for this book. I look forward to your second book, especially as someone with deep Pennsylvania ties. And we need more Black Pennsylvania stories and the Civil War experience in their families. So I see Mike here, so I know we have some questions.
Well, first of all, that was just a remarkable conversation, Dr. Green and Dr. Pinheiro. Thank you both for spreading a lot of knowledge and a lot of light and great warmth. And just thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing it with us. Um, we have a lot of questions, a lot of great questions. So let's jump right into them, if you
All
don't
right.
mind. I'm going to bundle together the first three from Ron Akhu, who asks, how did you come upon the persons you wrote about? Where did you do your research? And were all the persons or soldiers from Philadelphia? Men from New Jersey came to Philadelphia to join there.
Mhm.
I think you touched on all of those topics in your talk, Dr. Pinheiro, but
Mhm.
maybe maybe there's more to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So the how I would say the finding the sources, the very short, and again, a lot of this is in, as Dr. Green points out, in the methods. The very short version is I went to the National Archives and looked at the regimental books, and then compared those with what's called the compiled military service records. I will say, and I do note this in the introduction and the methods, is that I recognize that the people taking down, the usually white people taking down the information, didn't always do it accurately. So, for example, and I learned this awkward, like with actually the descendant, she's like, "Well, technically, my relative is from Chester," and I was like, "Oh God!" And she's like, "But I can understand why that happened because the person that was enlisting him probably said, 'Where's Chester?' And most likely the relative said, 'Oh, it's close to Philly.' All right, you're from Philly." So there is some of that in the records that I did want to acknowledge. And you're right, there are individuals not just from New Jersey, from everywhere. In the regimental books, I've seen people from Cuba, Canada, Peru, Germany, Jamaica. So there is so much more that we could continue to learn about these people's lives. Obviously, the Library Company of Philadelphia was very important for my research. And as I'm going to talk about tomorrow at 12 o'clock, was that the LCP really helped me to contextualize what is Black Philly, right? Because the military records are only talking about, and the pensions are talking about certain aspects, but I needed to know what was school like, what was the city streets like, what was the occupations like. So that was extremely helpful.
Thank you for mentioning the program tomorrow. Um, I'll repeat it again, but tomorrow at noon, Dr. Pinheiro is doing a little collections tour through some of the materials that I'm presuming you used during your research.
Oh yeah.
It is so satisfying and wonderful for me to hear scholars like yourselves who've used the collections talk about their importance in your work, because it just reminds me why the role the library company plays in writing new drafts of American history and distributing this knowledge. So
Well, like, no, I honestly, I couldn't have finished my dissertation without that short-term fellowship. So,
great. Question from Heidi Ramirez, who asks, can you talk about the different versions of or tasks of Black soldiering in the Civil War and how they were perceived, leveraged, and exploited? For example, what made the African Brigade distinct beyond, obviously, race?
all right, yeah, oh boy, that's a lot. That's a great question. I will try to give you the unsatisfactory short version. So, and I will just say, was it Heidi? If I'm got it correct, I think my third chapter goes in depth, and there are many other scholars who have, but the very short version is that unfortunately, due to pseudo-racial science, racial discrimination, and gender ideology, Black men, and not just African Americans, because Richard Reed, for example, notes that there were Afro-Canadians who also served as well. That Black men in uniform in the United States Army, they were put into more physically taxing situations to do what was known as fatigue duty. And the odd thing, as I tell students, is like what Black soldiers were doing was actually the most critical to the war effort, like function. So they're digging latrines, clearing dead bodies, putting up, tearing down military barracks, doing recon. I mean, all the very hard, literal, physical, damaging work. And unfortunately, when the Civil War is officially over on April 9th, 1865, and white soldiers in both armies get the racial privilege to go home, Black soldiers are forced to remain in service, so they're doing Reconstruction policies, including going to Texas. And a number of the soldiers that I looked at were actually part of Juneteenth, right? But what I try to do in this book is recognize African Americans aren't talking about Juneteenth the way we do now, because Black Philadelphian families were saying, what are they doing in Texas? Who is Napoleon III? What is going on in Mexico? Douglas said to enlist to fight Lee. Mission accomplished. And so many Black soldiers, unfortunately, will get life-threatening or die issues because of their being forced to stay in service because they're Black. And one of the other things I'll just close with is that, unfortunately, because in Glory they show this, and they're right, Black soldiers are paid $3 less than a white soldier of the same rank. But in reality, it was another $3 less because of a clothing deduction. So Black soldiers are getting paid $6 versus $13. So their lives are literally cheapened. And unfortunately, that reverberated to the families. So it doesn't just impact the soldiers, it impacts the families. And then on top of that, soldiers don't get paid for 9 months. So it's like, it's just a complete just debacle. And unfortunately, you see it play out for the families who are like, where's the money? Where's the money? We are literally starving to death. That's where, so when we talk about desertion, we need to not look at these men as cowards. The federal government has failed them.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions in the list that are asking about specific ancestors or specific people. I know that in the appendix to your book, it sounds like there's an incredible list of resources. But Evelyn Johns, for instance, asks, where can a person find the records for pensions for the Civil War and Revolutionary War for African Americans? Is there a list of Black PA pension receivers? I'm sure this is a big question, but maybe there's a high altitude view that could be helpful to Evelyn.
Evelyn, that's a great question. And what you're also highlighting is that we need a digital history project to do just that, honestly, at like an NEH grant, which would be great, because I would love, and not just me, people would love it. So the quick, probably unsatisfactory answer I would say is if you're familiar with, and I'm assuming through your local library, they usually have free editions, ancestry.com and Fold 3. And I want to be clear, particularly Fold 3, I am not a fan. I cannot, it's just hard for me to figure out how to use that database. However, there is pension records for people on there. Usually it's dependents, so widows, mothers, fathers, children. But you can also look for that through Ancestry. So Ancestry, you can actually look, if you do I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Hilary, like the military service, and you can look specifically for USCT enlistment records. And if you look through those, if you go all the way to the back after the muster out sheet, there's usually a lot of fascinating records, including soldiers getting, but not always, furloughs to go back home for their families, or the enlistment papers that has documents, including one I saw of a soldier writing on the edges of his enlistment, keep this, he's saying this to his wife, because I'm gonna die in service, and this is the only proof you're gonna have that you are my wife. So it's like I would say ancestry.com and Fold 3 would be the best starting point. If you have the resources and time, I would say National Archives, looking at the regimental books, if you know the regiments. And then correct me if I'm wrong, the Samuel Bates.
Yes.
And I think LCP might even have a copy of that, the Samuel Bates, that basically gives the list of the regiments and where they. So it takes a little bit of digging, but it is possible. I will say it is.
Yeah, and I'll add, especially as someone who has to find their own Pennsylvania Civil War ancestors, ancestry.com, if you know a name and you search for them. So go like your normal search records. But for me, burial records and findagrave.com, because one of the things that Ancestry will have is eventually they'll get headstones. And they will have to apply for headstones. So it'll be also a retroactive one. So if you have an ancestor that way, you know what cemetery is, that's one way to find them. And you will get some information on those records there as well. And then also the cards, the pension cards.
Yep.
And sometimes once you have that and you have the number, you can request for the file
Yes.
itself. So there's ways to go there. But one thing is, if it happens, if you have an ancestor who was a dependent who gets labeled as an invalid, there might be a chance where your record might not be at the National Archives because they are still getting money up until the 1970s.
Right.
Those are a different case, but at
Right.
least if you reach out to the National Archives, once you know what their pension number is, they will let you know if they have it or not.
My only
And
advice,
that is important.
and Dr. Green probably knows this too, if you're using Ancestry, don't hit exact words or exact phrase, because if you do that, that's the problem. Because I noticed when I stopped doing that, because sometimes the people taking down their information and the names spelled it wrong, or they'll have question marks. So even they're like, I don't know what this person's name is. So don't, even if you're like, it's John Johnson, don't make it exact, because it doesn't mean the person writing their name wrote it correct.
That's a really useful answer. Thank you. Pamela McDonald asks a wonderfully specific question. I understand your focus on free Africans from Philadelphia. I have two great-grandfathers who had been enslaved in Mississippi and Tennessee and would have enlisted from contraband camps.
Mhm.
Questions. Do you know a researcher who concentrates on formerly enslaved USCT colored troops?
Mhm.
And I have located all kinds of military documents and Freedmen's Bank documentation of a pension deposited after death.
Mhm.
But could you help direct me to resources to locate the detailed pension records you referred to?
So that was Pamela. I'll just say, and Dr. Green also knows about this. In Natchez, Mississippi, they're doing some phenomenal work right now to commemorate with an actual like whole monument to the USDT. And I had the privilege of doing a presentation there, and I didn't know this, but someone that was doing research there said that they said like over 50 or 60% of the people that live there are descendants of USDT soldiers. So it's possible you might want to reach out to people at Natchez, Mississippi, for some resources there.
Yeah, and one of the things I would also say is the Grand Army of the Republic. Natchez, Mississippi had very active Black unions, including through the Mississippi Department of State Archives, has pictures of them too, and some decent records. So the State Archives of Mississippi in Jackson will be a good resource. And then for Tennessee, it depends on which part. If they are near any of the national parks of, are they from Chickamauga area, depending on where, those national parks also have been really good with details on those who enlisted from contraband camps. And then the other one would be Camp Nelson in Kentucky, because that is a major one there too. So I know they have been specializing in that part of the world, especially where a lot of those contrabands will come in. But you might also want to look at the HBCUs, in particular, Fisk and Tennessee State. Those will be other ways too, because those descendants will also make sure that the records were contained, and they probably have lists there from the that were done by those two institutions of higher ed.
That's wonderful. I'm going to ask this question because someone took the time to type it in. It's a little political, but I'll let you do what you want with it. Stanley Field asks, could this book be taught in Florida?
Well, as a Central Floridian, I would say yes. I'll just say that I've done this presentation. Well, I've done the traditional presentation in numerous places, and regardless of anyone's political affiliation, and I've gotten the wide spectrum, is that this is about military families. And so for me, it's like, I'm not pushing my views other than to say, we need to understand and respect military families' experiences go beyond their service and go beyond those in uniform or those with the title of veteran. So yeah, I'm sure some people could look at this easily and not like it for insert reason. But again, for me, this is not, at the end of the day, this is about empowering family history. But yeah, would I be shocked if I saw it on a ban list? No. I'd probably laugh and Have a
Yeah.
glass of wine.
Yeah,
actually,
especially in a military community like Florida, as someone with also a family member, retired Navy 30 years. Are you for military service or not? Are you for veterans and for whom? So I would hope it still gets
Right.
taught, but I would not be surprised either if it gets put on a ban list.
right. Um, Dr. Pinheiro, your last answer actually leads very nicely into the question from Helen Weary, which is, do you think current veterans and their families have the same pension difficulties?
Yes and no. Obviously, there, thank God, is no slavery. But I'll just say that even when I worked at the University of Alabama, I had a student who served in Iraqi freedom, and he was like, "I'm still struggling with like the bureaucracy." Um, really, anyone I've talked to, I mean, like people working on my HVAC, to just when I talk to anyone who says I've served, because my first question, I want to talk to them as a human being, like, what'd you serve? What'd you do? You know, and they, the one thing I've noted the most is the frustration with the bureaucracy and the ways in which the federal government continues to inject itself into people's lives, uh, especially the relatives who are like, I never served. Why are you asking me for all my personal information in these ways? In order to, it's there. And I'll just close with this. When I did this presentation at the University of Georgia, a Vietnam vet stood up at the end of my presentation. He cried. So then I cried. We cried together. And he was just like, you get that I'm more than that label. You get that I'm still fighting right now. And what does it say that this is 100+ years removed? And yes, the circumstances are different, but I still am struggling to get like access to for mental health issues. And it's like that hurts, like to hear people say that. Like there shouldn't be a legacy of bureaucracy and oversight. It should be, you've done more than I could ever do. So it's hard when I hear someone say that they can still see it. So I take seriously that.
Yeah. Well, if anyone has any other questions, I think we are a little bit over time, but it's really been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I have learned enormously, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has as well. So thank you both. Again, Dr. Pinheiro is doing a little show and tell tomorrow. I'd urge you to come down to Locust Street. If those of you who are still within the sound of my voice, come down and see us. And otherwise, thank you both very much for a wonderful program. Thank all of you for
Thank you.
tuning in tonight. This, I believe that this will be available on YouTube. It'll take us a little while to edit it and clean it up, but this will become a sort of standing document. Our YouTube channel has all of our, a lot of our past programs in it. It's a wonderful library unto itself. And again, please come back and join us for our other programs. You can find out what we're doing on social media. You can go to our website, which has a really good events page, and learn more and continue to join our learning community. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.